It's time for episode 19, a two-parter, Desertion of the Dinobots, part 1. We're going to get into it this time on Energon Entries. Welcome back to Energon Entries, everybody. As always, this is your host, Matt Freites. I hope that this finds you well, and I want to thank you for your patience last week. I went out of town this weekend for a wedding. It was a long weekend. My family and I were trying to get ready for this trip, and I just ran out of time and could not prioritize making content over trying to get ready for my family. If anybody who's listening is married out there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Family first, and so that's what we did here. So I appreciate everybody. And now we're going to talk about episode 19, Desertion of the Dinobots. This is part 1. We'll talk about part 2 next time. And with that, let's get into the episode recap. The episode begins with Optimus Prime and the Autobots being shown a new drone fighter at a lab, only to have Megatron plot to steal the fighter's blueprints. The Decepticons, led by Soundwave and Ravage, create a diversion while Starscream destroys the drone. After a battle at the lab, the Autobots fend off the Decepticons. Later, at the airport, Spike, Carly, and Bumblebee discover a Decepticon base in a hangar and call for reinforcements. The Dinobots are sent in to help and successfully trash the Decepticons, but Megatron retaliates by causing an explosion that damages the Dinobots, allowing the Decepticons to retreat. Meanwhile, the Decepticons experience mysterious malfunctions, which Megatron attributes to bad Energon, forcing them to refuel at a power plant. Back at the Autobot base, the Dinobots refuse to follow Prime's orders, choosing to fight on their own terms. Both Autobots and Decepticons begin suffering from Cybertonium depletion, leading to further malfunctions. While Prime and the Autobots are incapacitated, Spike, Carly, and Sparkplug convince the Dinobots to help retrieve Cybertonium from Cybertron. Grimlock eventually agrees, leading the Dinobots through the space bridge. The episode ends with Spike and Carly deciding to travel to Cybertron themselves as Optimus Prime succumbs to the effects of Cybertonium depletion and Shockwave awaits their arrival. So as always with a two-parter, there's usually some overarching story. Now, with the Transformers in general, we know that the overarching story generally tends to be Decepticons do something bad, Autobots try to react, end up saving the day. So this is an episode, though, that's a little bit different because, in my mind, it's nice to see an episode that has a return to Cybertron in it. I feel like in season 2, we haven't really seen that a lot. We haven't returned to the origin of the Transformers in quite a while. And so to me, it's nice to see that. And this war on Earth is all the return to Cybertron, but throughout the entirety of season 2, we don't see much of it. And I feel like that is a missed opportunity. So the humans and Autobots still testing out new tech as we start this episode off. And of course, it's in the middle of the day. They're not thinking about the Decepticons at all. And I feel like this is pretty on par. It's on brand for both the Autobots and the humans to not take into consideration something that has happened literally every other episode. But throughout this episode, we see the Transformers start to randomly lose control of their powers. And this is a really good way to show probably what's going to happen in part 2. And as I'm watching it, I'm thinking that. I'm thinking the audience at that time, kids, are probably thinking, like, what is going to happen? Like, what is happening? It was done throughout the episode, and it wasn't right away. It was definitely a nice buildup, in my opinion. And them being unable to transform, unable to use their secondary powers, you saw that creep up and creep in. And I really, really enjoy that. And as it went over time, they started losing some motor skills. They lost their ability to fly, the Decepticons specifically. So you saw it affecting the Autobots and the Decepticons alike. They're all in this together, which is something you don't see too often. It's usually an us versus them mentality, and I really like that. Throughout the course of this, though, there is a huge fight at the beginning, and we see an airport get absolutely destroyed. And not just blown up, but airplanes going through, there's people in there, and you have to ask, with all these planes that are getting destroyed, are there humans that were in those planes? We kind of get an answer because we see the Autobots attempting to help out to repair the airport, so we know that this is how it's going to get fixed. And you see teamwork from the Autobots, which is really neat. Power Glide and Grapple and Ironhide really helping out, trying to put all this through. But this is when you see the first sign of things happening as Grapple can't line up what he has to line up, and I believe it was the roof of the bridge. So when it comes to the human beings, like, this episode is both Autobot focused, but also human focused, and that's really a lead into part 2. But as far as the humans are concerned, Bumblebee is a third wheel on a date with Spike and Carly, and I kind of like that. It was kind of hilarious because when I think about Bumblebee obviously has a place within the Autobot ranks. He's scrappy, he's loyal, he's always going to be there. But he also, for the most part, seems to be the most human of the Autobots in that he enjoys human activities. And on this date, they're at an amusement park and they bring him on one of the rides. I think it was like the Tilt-A-Whirl or whatever. And he's not feeling anything. He doesn't understand why this ride is something that the humans feel a certain way about. And so they changed something and his equilibrium was thrown off and now he gets it. And I kind of like that. I like that there's a little humanity there. Spike and Carly then say they have to go. They have to pick up Sparkplug from the airport, which is interesting because so far throughout this entire show, Spike and Sparkplug have been wearing their work clothes and have never gone anywhere. So Sparkplug is coming back from somewhere and he's wearing a suit. And this is way out of the norm. So I was definitely thrown off by that. And I kind of humorously thought to myself, I thought he wore the hard hat everywhere. Like, it would have almost been funnier if he came off the plane with a suit and a hard hat on because I'm so used to seeing that. But one plot hole is that they never tell us where he's coming from, why he left. I think that you're supposed to assume that it's some type of a work function because he's in a suit, but we kind of don't know. I wish they did give us a little more backstory about that. But throughout this episode, Carly has shown that she is a baddie. She really is a badass. And she's willing to do whatever it takes to get the Autobots and rescue them. And that's one thing that separates her from Spike. I mean, Spike is willing to do that, so Sparkplug to an extent. But Carly actually delivers, and Spike does not. And so the fact that they're together, despite all the age stuff that we've talked about, Spike is outkicking his coverage here for sure. He is definitely dating up. And you know what? I have to applaud the man, or the kid, because I think that's a great thing. So Carly is amazing, and she's showing it in this episode. And I have a feeling, watching this, or had a feeling, that we're going to see more of it in the next episode. So let's go to the actual Autobots here. The Autobots start the episode, and they actually do have an answer. They have an answer for Soundwave. Now, Soundwave is spying on them. But the irony here is, like I said earlier, they're testing out new equipment in the middle of the day, not thinking about the Decepticons at all. But Ironhide is there, and so is Soundwave. And I was a little confused because why is Soundwave transformed sitting inside Ironhide? And how does he not know that? That part I don't get. But they do have an answer. And that answer comes in new Autobot, Blaster, who I love. He's a boombox. I grew up in a time in which boomboxes were still kind of a thing for teenagers, and so I love that. But despite Blaster being there, and despite his interference, the Decepticons still managed to destroy the technology anyway. And I don't know what that says about Blaster's fighting ability. At least in the opening scene where he's taking out or trying to take out Ravage and Soundwave, he doesn't succeed. And so the Decepticons end up succeeding in the end. So even when the Autobots are somewhat proactive, they fail. In this episode as well, we see Mirage. He's one of the OG Autobots, as I call them, that hasn't been seen a lot. But we do see his invincibility power come to good use, and I kind of like that. And he attempts to steal Megatron's fusion cannon. That's a really smart thing to do because Megatron is the most powerful Decepticon, and his fusion cannon causes a lot of havoc. So why not use a power of invisibility and actually try to steal his cannon? I did say invincibility earlier. I meant invisibility, so pardon me on that one. Once again, though, another OG Autobot comes into play, and it's somebody that I talked about last episode, and it's Hound. Hound once again proves his worth, and he creates a Megatron hologram to fake out Starscream and Soundwave, and they end up retreating. And they do so because, honestly, the Decepticons do retreat a lot, and Starscream kind of makes reference to that, saying, we always retreat, or something like that. So Hound is very useful. In this season, I feel like we haven't seen him a lot, but when we have seen him, he's been extremely helpful, extremely useful, and I wish we'd see more of him, quite honestly, because I love his voice, I love his character, and I feel like he's doing a lot of great work for the Decepticons. Another OG Autobot that we see is Wheeljack, and he's telling Optimus Prime, he's at the base, they're trying to fight off the Decepticons, and Optimus Prime says, we need to send help. And Wheeljack says, we're understaffed. Well, what the hell does that mean? How can the Autobots be understaffed? One of the things that bothers me about this show is there's a lot of continuity problems in terms of scale and in terms of what we see on the screen. And I think it was a few episodes ago where the Autobots were having Autobot Day, and the Decepticons used fake journalism to basically say that they were bad, that the Autobots were bad. and they sent them off. And I said it was great to see all the Autobots there. And there was like 30 Autobots. In this episode, there's 5 Autobots that are trying to fend off the Decepticons at the airport. And that means that there has to be like 20-something at the base. And if they're not at the base, if they are understaffed, where are they? You only see a handful of them at the crash site. So like, where is everybody else? So of course, whenever they can't send people, they go to the Dinobots, and they're always a last resort. It's a trend. And the Dinobots should not be used that way. They're not being used to their full potential. And the more times that this happens, the more times I realize that Grimlock's gripes about how they're used and what they're asked to do are more and more valid. We do see some new Autobots before we get to the Dinobots, and that's Red Alert back for a brief appearance. And it sticks out because it basically sticks to his personality in Auto Berserk. He worries, but he worries for good reason. That's why his name is Red Alert, and that's what he always does. But let's go to the Dinobots for a minute. So the Dinobots are used in this episode as a last resort, and Optimus Prime still doesn't trust them, I guess, even though we had an episode that sort of assimilated them into the collective, and we were supposed to believe that now the Autobots, you're one of us now. Every time they go to use the Dinobots, they're in this room, and they're in this room that seems just big enough for them, that is not really meant to be lived in. And when I see this, I think this seems very cruel. The Dinobots are way more disobedient and teenager-like in this episode than I remember. But like I said, when we see their living conditions, we see how they're used, I kind of can't blame them. Now, the Dinobots get to the airport and they start to fight the Decepticons. And the Decepticons never really have any answers. But the Dinobots' size, this goes back to what I talked about with inconsistencies along the show. Their size is all over the place. When they're in the hangar, the Dinobots look the same size as the other Decepticons. When they're outside, they look like they're about as big as the Empire State Building. There is no consistency as to how big these Dinobots are. I assume and think that the Dinobots are supposed to be larger than the Autobots and even the Decepticons. That's why they're so powerful. And that's why the Constructicons have to use something like Devastator to fight them off. When you don't get this scale right, it just, I don't know. Like, again, I know that this is a cartoon. I know it's 40 years old. I just don't like this lack of consistency when it comes to the animation. It's very bothersome to me. But one thing that did happen through all of this is through all of their disobedience and deciding that they wanted to forge their own path, the other Dinobots, I believe it was Slag, said that Grimlock was their leader. So in a way, this is kind of growth because now we're firmly establishing Grimlock as their leader. And I do think that that is great. And I really do like that. I think that we need a little bit more character development. We don't see the Dinobots very often, and this is a great way to do that. Now, when you go to the Decepticon side of things, at the beginning of this big plan, Starscream asked Megatron when discretion ever mattered to the Decepticons, and it's one of those where Starscream clearly hasn't paid attention to all the other plans where they've had discretion at their side, and it's been successful. Whenever they use discretion, which they do a lot because they break in, they spy, it always works. And so I love that Starscream hasn't grasped this point yet and is questioning Megatron in a way that is just not valid. So Megatron and the crew, though, are able to distract the Autobots way, way too easily. And they do so with an exploded plane. And this again speaks to the Autobots always reacting, not being proactive. But all in all, though, the Decepticons did not have any answers for the Dinobots. I said that earlier. And they sure don't on their own. They have to bring in the Constructicons. And this time, the Constructicons go right to Devastator. And they put the Dinobots on the space bridge to Cybertron. And the only thing I asked was, I wonder if that means that the Constructicons aren't affected by the loss of Cybertonium, because nothing happened to them. They were able to operate the exact same. They don't really explain that, but I have to assume that that's the case in this particular episode, the way that it has been presented. Now, when we get to the end of the episode, Shockwave, of course, is the gatekeeper, the guardian of Cybertron, and he looked to be holding a mini version of himself in gun mode as a weapon when the Dinobots came on and when obviously the humans came on. And that's when the episode actually faded to be continued. But I thought it was interesting because it's exactly a replica of him, just a little bit smaller. So I did appreciate that, and I do wonder if that was on purpose or if Shockwave is just a larger version and assimilated himself to being and transforming into something that already existed on Cybertron. We did have one animation quirk in here where Megatron was all white in gun mode. That's the only one that I saw, but it's just something that was fascinating because it was very, very close up. So very, very easy to see. Overall, this episode was fine, only because it's setting up for a next episode. So I'm not really going to have a lot of overall thoughts on it. A little bit more Dinobot-centric, a little bit more human-centric, which I like. It'll be interesting to kind of piece it all together to figure out, or I guess evaluate how good this episode was. Next time, we're going to talk about part 2 of this 2-part episode, which will be Desertion of the Dinobots part 2. If you haven't yet, if you're listening, go to YouTube, Energon Entries, Transformers Talk on YouTube. Check out my review of Transformers 1, the movie, on YouTube. It got really good reception, so anybody that watched it, I do really, really appreciate it. We're now on Instagram, so if you want to follow the Instagram account, Energon Entries Pod is the handle to do so. And I do appreciate all the people that have reached out to say that they listen to the show, and I appreciate every single one of you. Hope this finds everybody well. I hope this finds everybody safe, and I will talk to you next time. This is Energon Entries. The opinions and viewpoints expressed on Energon Entries are those of Matt Freitz and his guests, and not necessarily those of the Matty Ice Media Network. Energon Entries is exclusively owned by Matt Freitz and is brought to you by the Matty Ice Media Network.